They were dying inside their own aircraft, not from enemy guns, not from flak bursting through the fuselage. They were burning alive, in machines built to protect them. And it kept happening. Mission after mission, until someone who wasn't supposed to have answers found one. This is about the bomber that killed its own crews and the mechanic who made them stop. A bomber was supposed to be a fortress. That's what they called them. Flying fortresses. The name suggested strength, armor, safety in numbers. Men climbed into these machines believing engineering and firepower would bring them home. But inside, it felt different. The fuselage was narrow, cold at altitude, crowded with fuel lines, oxygen bottles, ammunition belts, and 10 men pressed into spaces barely wide enough to move. The bomber wasn't a fortress. It was a flying fuel tank wrapped in aluminum, and everyone inside knew it. When something went wrong, there was nowhere to go. Fire was the thing crews feared most, not the flak fields over the Ruhr, not the fighters climbing out of the sun. Fire. Because once it started, you had seconds, maybe less, and the exits were small, the parachutes tangled, the flames faster than thought. And it kept starting. The problem wasn't just that bombers caught fire. All aircraft do when hit hard enough. The problem was how quickly a survivable hit became unsurvivable. A single puncture in the wrong fuel line could fill the fuselage with vapor. A spark from damaged wiring, a hot fragment of shrapnel, even friction from a jammed turret. Any of it could ignite the air inside. The fuel system ran through the entire length of the aircraft. Lines snaked past crew positions, under floors, behind bulkheads. When a shell tore through the wing or belly, it often severed these lines. Fuel didn't just leak, it atomized. It filled the confined space with mist that waited for ignition. And when it ignited, the fire moved faster than men could. The crews understood this in a way that reports never captured. They felt it every time they climbed through the hatch. The smell of aviation fuel was constant, a reminder that they were sitting inside something designed to burn. They saw the fuel lines running overhead, beside their stations, close enough to touch. They knew that a single piece of shrapnel in the wrong place could turn the entire fuselage into a furnace. Some men developed rituals, touching certain parts of the aircraft before takeoff, sitting in specific positions. Small gestures meant to create the illusion of control in a situation where control didn't exist. Others just stopped thinking about it. You couldn't fly 30 missions thinking about fire. You went numb or you didn't go at all. But the fire didn't care about rituals or numbness. Escape hatches existed, but they were small. The waist gunners had a window. The bombardier had a hatch in the nose. The ball turret gunner had to be cranked back into position before he could even try to get out. In practice, when fire broke out, half the crew never made it to an exit. They were trapped by flame, by smoke, by the geometry of their own aircraft. The ball turret was the worst. A plexiglass sphere bolted to the underside of the fuselage, barely wide enough for one man in a fetal crouch. The gunner entered through a hatch in the fuselage floor, then the turret rotated into position. If the hydraulics failed, if the mechanism jammed, if fire broke out before he could be rotated back, he stayed there, locked in a glass ball, watching the flames spread above him, unable to reach his parachute, unable to do anything but wait. Crews talked about it in the barracks. They didn't talk about fighters or flak. They talked about fire. about who got out and who didn't, about how fast it spread, about the moment when you realized the plane was already gone and you weren't. They talked about the smell. Burning fuel has a specific odor, sharp and chemical. It was the last thing many men smelled. The ones who survived remembered it for decades. The ones who didn't left behind aircraft that returned to base empty or didn't return at all. The numbers reflected it. Aircraft were coming back with fire damage that should have been survivable, but the crews were dead. Not from the initial hit, from what happened after, from the 30 seconds between impact and immolation when the fuel system turned a repairable aircraft into a crematorium. Engineers knew this. Command knew this. The fuel system design was documented. The vulnerability was understood. Reports existed, filed in offices far from the airfields, describing the problem in technical language that made it sound manageable. But nothing changed. Production was the priority. Bombers were rolling off assembly lines by the hundreds, emerging from factories in a steady stream that had its own momentum. Modifications meant delays. Delays meant fewer aircraft over target. Fewer aircraft meant longer wars, more missions for the crews already flying, higher losses spread across a smaller force. The math was brutal and simple. Better to accept some losses to fire than to slow production. Better to lose crews in a known, documented way than to disrupt the system that was supposed to win the war. Doctrine played a role too. Bombers were supposed to fly in formation, rely on mutual defense, saturate enemy airspace with numbers. Individual survivability mattered less than collective presence. The strategy wasn't about bringing every crew home. It was about putting enough bombers over the target that some would get through. If losses stayed within acceptable range, 10%, 12% per mission, the campaign continued. The crews were replaceable. The mission wasn't. Acceptable range, that was the term. As if there was a number of burning men that made sense on a spreadsheet. Field complaints reached headquarters, but they arrived as anecdotes, scattered reports from different units, different theaters. No single voice was loud enough to overcome the inertia of production schedules and strategic planning. Each incident was reviewed individually, cataloged, filed. The pattern existed, but it never cohered into a mandate for change. And so the bombers kept flying with the same fuel lines, the same routing, the same vulnerability, because the system that built them was not designed to learn quickly. It was designed to manufacture, to deploy, to sustain operations at a scale that made individual modifications seem trivial. The crews kept dying because changing the system would have required someone in authority to declare that the system was wrong. And the people in authority were the same ones who had approved the design in the first place. But someone on the ground was learning? He was a mechanic, not an officer, not a test pilot, not someone whose name appeared on engineering reports or procurement documents. He worked in a maintenance unit at an airfield that could have been anywhere, patching holes, replacing engines, cleaning blood out of turrets, scrubbing carbon, scoring off bulkheads. He saw the aircraft that came back and the ones that didn't. He read the damage reports. He talked to the crews who survived and listened to what they said about the ones who didn't. And he started noticing a pattern. The bombers that burned didn't always take catastrophic damage. Sometimes the hit was small, a single hole in the fuselage, maybe two, minor shrapnel damage that the crew could have survived if they'd had time. But the fire spread anyway because the fuel line was right there, exposed, waiting. He began looking at where the lines ran, not just glancing, but studying. He traced them through the fuselage with his hands, marking the points where they passed crew stations, where they sat inches from hot metal or electrical systems. He saw that the standard configuration left them vulnerable not just to direct combat damage, but to secondary failures. A severed line dripping onto a heated surface, a spark igniting vapor in a closed compartment, a punctured fitting that turned a slow leak into a spray of atomized fuel. These were predictable failures, the kind that happen when you route pressurized fuel through a combat zone wrapped in thin aluminum. He started carrying a notebook, sketching the fuel system layout, noting where the failures occurred most often, cross-referencing damage reports with crew accounts. He wasn't conducting an official investigation. He was just trying to understand why the same men kept dying in the same way. And he realized something simple. You could reroute them, not everywhere, not completely. The fuel had to get from the tanks to the engines, and there were only so many paths through the airframe. But in key sections, in the places where a puncture was most likely to turn lethal, you could move the lines, run them lower, behind reinforced structure, away from crew positions and electrical systems and hot metal. You could add baffles to contain leaks, install quick shut-off valves so a punctured line didn't drain the entire tank into the fuselage, use armored sleeves in high-risk sections. None of this required new technology or factory retooling. It just required someone to see the problem and decide it was worth fixing. He started doing it. First on one aircraft. He chose a bomber that had come back with fire damage, one that was scheduled for repair anyway. While he was patching the holes and replacing damaged sections, he rerouted the fuel lines in the affected area, moved them 6 inches lower, added a shut-off valve, reinforced the fittings. It took him 3 extra hours. He didn't log the time. He didn't mention it in his report. He just did it, tested the system, and sent the aircraft back to flight status. Then he waited. The bomber flew again, took damage again, came back again. This time, the fuel line that would have ruptured stayed intact. The crew reported minor fire that they'd been able to extinguish. Everyone walked away. It could have been luck. One incident doesn't prove anything. But he kept watching that aircraft, and it kept coming back, and the crews kept surviving hits that should have killed them. So he modified another one, then another. He didn't ask permission. There was no formal process for this. Field modifications happened all the time, small adjustments that crew chiefs made to keep aircraft flying. But this was different. This was changing a core system based on nothing but observation and intuition. He worked at night after inspections, in the hours when no one was watching closely. He used spare parts, scrap material, whatever he could find. He kept his notes in his pocket, not in official logs. Other mechanics noticed. Some thought he was wasting time, adding unnecessary work to an already brutal schedule. Others saw what he was doing and stayed quiet, the way you stay quiet when someone's doing something that might be against regulations, but feels right. A few started helping. They shared techniques, figured out which modifications worked best, which could be done quickly between missions. They developed a system, unofficial and undocumented, for making bombers slightly less likely to kill their crews. The aircraft they modified kept flying, and when they took damage, fewer of them burned. It wasn't dramatic. There were no headlines, no commendations. But crews began requesting specific aircraft. They didn't always know why these particular bombers felt different, but they knew. The ones where a hit didn't mean instant fire. The ones that gave you a chance. Word spread quietly, the way important information always does among people whose lives depend on details. Pilots talked to other pilots. Crew chiefs compared notes. The modifications moved laterally, airfield to airfield, unit to unit, carried forward by people who had seen what worked. Some commands noticed and looked the other way. Others actively encouraged it, telling their mechanics to implement whatever changes kept crews alive, regardless of what the manual said. A few tried to stop it, citing regulations and standardization requirements, but by then it was too late. The modifications had spread too far, helped too many crews. Trying to reverse them would have meant ordering mechanics to make aircraft more dangerous, and no one wanted to sign that order. Command didn't stop it. They didn't authorize it either. It simply happened in the gap between doctrine and reality, where the people closest to the problem made their own decisions. The survival rate improved, not everywhere, not completely. Bombers still burned. Men still died. The war didn't stop being brutal just because one mechanic noticed a pattern and decided to act. But the margin shifted. A crew that would have been lost in the first 30 seconds now had a minute to shut off fuel flow, to grab the fire extinguisher, to fight the flames instead of just dying in them. A minute to reach the hatches, get the ball turret gunner out, make it to the exits while the aircraft was still flyable. That margin was the difference between a name on a memorial and a man walking off a transport ship after the war, between a telegram to a family and a reunion at a train station, between a statistic and a life. Some crews never knew why they survived. They took the same hits as aircraft that burned, but they made it home. They attributed it to luck, to skill, to divine intervention. They didn't know about the mechanic who had rerouted their fuel lines on a night shift 3 months earlier. He didn't receive a medal. His name didn't appear in after-action reports or unit citations. When the war ended, he went home like everyone else, carrying his notebook with the sketches and notes that had saved lives he would never meet. The modifications he pioneered were eventually incorporated into later production models, but by then they were attributed to engineering reviews and safety assessments. Official channels claimed credit for solutions that had originated in an unauthorized field modification by someone who wasn't supposed to question the design. That's often how it works. Wars are not won by the manuals. They're won by the people who notice what the manuals miss, the ones who see the problem every day, who watch men die for preventable reasons, and who decide that waiting for someone else to fix it is not an option. The system has its place. Production schedules, strategic planning, engineering standards. These things matter. But systems move slowly, and men burn quickly, and sometimes the only thing standing between a crew and death is one person willing to act without permission. The bombers that came home carried more than bombs and machine guns. They carried the quiet work of people who refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. Mechanics who stayed late, crew chiefs who shared techniques, men who saw a problem and fixed it because they could, because it needed fixing, because no one else was going to. And sometimes that refusal, made in the dark by someone whose name we'll never know, is what survival looks like. Not glory, not recognition. Just the small, stubborn decision to make things slightly less deadly, one aircraft at a time, until the war ends and everyone goes home. That's the legacy. Not written in official histories, not celebrated in memorials, just carried forward in the lives that continued because someone noticed, someone cared, and someone acted. The bomber stopped killing its own crews the moment one mechanic decided it didn't have to.